Welcome to Widow's Bay. There's so much to see here. Come with me. I'll show you around. There is something about these seafaring towns of superstitions, their tall tales.
Looks like Widow's Bay is blessing us with 2 episodes this week, and I'm really looking forward to breaking these down. We get a flashback into the history of the town's horror with Sarah Fear and whatever. Oh, wait, that's actually Fear Street. No, in Widow's Bay, it turns out we'll be following Sarah Westcott, played by Betty Gilpin, who's been around in many shows and movies, but my most memorable one was the movie Hunt, where she played a very different character.
You fucked up, bitch!
But when it comes to Widow's Bay, she's playing the newlywed wife of Richard Warren. We see as Sarah is arriving on the island and nervous to marry the founder in Richard. As Sarah is taken in, she passes by someone suffering an illness with an X on the door, likely to indicate quarantine. Sarah asks about Richard's reputation, and Pastor Collins offers his help if Sarah should ever need it. And interestingly enough, when meeting Richard Warren, he just so happens to be played by Hamish Linklater. We'll break down more of the irony of this role for him and its connections to Midnight Mass towards the end of the video. Either way, they immediately prepare to get married, and the vows are a little bit interesting, with Sarah vowing that she'll be bound to him and the handmaiden to the Lord Island Protector. Sarah eventually meets Richard's kids, Thomas, John, Cornwall, Holyoke, and Francis, one of whom is likely to play a key role in the horrors of the island for the rest of the series. Sarah journals about how things aren't going exactly how she planned, but she's trying to keep faith. She hears a noise and wanders down to find Richard having cut open his hand and have some of that black stuff entering it. His eyes wide over until for a moment he snaps out of it just to ward her off. Though as she walks away, his eyes are already glossed over again. The next day, she sees a resident who fell to the plague, the same plague referenced in episode 1. Sarah hears more about the plague's victims, like Cornelius Heavensby, who at first had no symptoms beyond a headache, and claiming they later ended up finding him holding his wife on the ground, pressing his fingers into her skull. Sarah later eavesdrops and hears rumor that Richard is in communion with the island, and that he can tame it and is the only reason they survived the first years they settled. The gentleman claiming that he kisses his necklace like a cross, but wonders what's actually in there and what covenant he built, before Richard finally lets it loose and murders him. Overwhelmed, Sarah reaches out to the pastor, revealing Richard's murder, and the pastor claims that evil stalks this land and he believes the devil has chosen Richard for some unknown purpose. They fear that Richard Warren is actually consorting with the devil. Sarah claims she just needs to leave this island, but the pastor urges her to look at things differently and that possibly God chose her for some greater purpose, which is an oddly suspicious thing to say. He plans for her to leave the front door unlatched so they may enter and do what must be done. And later while she sleeps, an assassin sneaks in and almost mistakes her for Richard and bodies her right there on the spot before she corrects him and points him in the right direction. Though it's as he's being stabbed and Sarah flees that later we hear some rustling upstairs and the assassin comes flying down with Richard following behind just fine and covered with blood. It's his immunity to being stabbed here that made me potentially consider that he could be the boogeyman of the entire show, though by the end of the episode we'll see why that theory doesn't necessarily hold up. Either way, he gives her a very unnerving speech claiming that he will unearth the one who bears the guilt of the island and that none may hide forever on an island where there is no way out. I really feel for Sarah, and this motif of Widow's Bay keeps fitting the narrative of the show with her struggle contrasted with the character's history like Tom. Either way, the next day, Sarah tries to leave the house, but the doors are barricaded. She goes down into the tunnels that she stumbled upon earlier and finds a cave system with blood and hair on the walls, eventually leading to the cellar doors we saw in the very first episode, only this time covered in a lot more blood. Potentially this is where the sacrifice is made? Either way, Sarah flees and escapes through the well, The same well we saw the pastor hearing sounds from earlier. Searching for the pastor and screaming that Richard's still alive, she frantically reveals everything she knows. They claim there's a boat out there with her name on it if she can just help them out one more time by drugging Richard Warren, begging her to think of her children.
Consider the welfare of your children.
My children, I have but just met them.
They claim that she's their only hope, which honestly sounds like cap, but it segues us into a diary entry that was referenced last episode. Though Richard suspects something's off and requests to read her writing, amping up the tensions for their future encounter. Later at supper, she offers him the brandy, but when he refuses, claiming he needs to remain clear-headed, she resorts to trying to seduce him, with her pushing him flirtatiously to take a drink and him pushing her to do the same. Only she spits it out right in front of him, and it finally clues him in to her being a traitor as well. He finally loses it and begins strangling her, but she is saved by his very own kids. She attempts to flee with them on a rowboat before they're eventually approached by Abigail, who we've seen throughout the island, and has definitely been infected at this point by her doctor husband. Sarah, tired of everyone controlling her life and telling her what to do, finally picks up an oar and fights for the children and herself, smacking Abigail when she goes demon mode. Richard wakes up surrounded by his conspirators who attempt to open his necklace, but Richard warns that it doesn't want them to open it. Same it that's been keeping them alive. He claims it wasn't the devil and it was some sort of god, the townsfolk assuming he's just gone mad. They prepare to bury him as he's freaking out, claiming they'll doom themselves if they betray the pact that had helped them survive the very first winter, claiming that it spoke to him through the mushrooms. He begs them to fulfill the pact and take a life for a sacrifice, promising that everything he's done has been for his people. If they fulfill the pact, the plague will stop, but if they don't, the terrors will deepen, and they claim that it's too late and his wife is taking his kids far away to the mainland. Richard Warren begins begging them not to, as it will kill them all, alluding to the curse that befalls those who are born on the island and can't ever leave, with him screaming for their safety as he's finally buried alive, which then flashes us forward to Wick unburying him. Which I gotta say, the irony of Hamish Linklater playing a guy who was trapped on an island and buried alive, unearthing its deeper secrets, is oddly resemblant of how he came into power and became a leader of another mysterious island in Midnight Mass. Not as mysterious as Widow's Bay, but definitely an interesting story that's worth checking out. It's only one season, so if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I highly recommend you watch it. This leads us to episode 7, where Tom wakes up after having slept for an entire day following his mushroom trip. They arrive at Richard Warren's old home / the museum. Patricia drinks from a Richard Warren cup as she explains why they dug up the founder's corpse. They also reveal that he's still alive, and Tom seems shocked, indicating to us that everything we saw in the flashback episode was not exactly what Tom was witnessing. They reveal that Richard only really wants to talk to the Lord Island Protector, who they assume is Tom, and they ask Tom to see if he can get them to open up the necklace, them both freaking out when Tom tries to do it himself, claiming that it's a little bit dangerous. This makes me wonder if that black stuff we saw earlier happened to go into Wick's hand when he tried to open it. Either way, Tom cautiously approaches Richard before Patricia jump scares him.
I'll give you to your privacy.
And he eventually reveals that he was tricked by a devil and betrayed by his lessers, eventually opening up his necklace and finding a note that he thought was his salvation.
When they couldn't even find vermin to sate their hunger, some ate corpses, others gorged on dirt, and Richard Warren himself was contemplating how to end his own life with his very own hand. At least that's before he saw it.
This is likely in reference to the storm from hell, or at least the first storm they had to encounter when they arrived on the island. Tom asks what it exactly was, and Richard calls it either a demon or the island itself. It offered covenant for the island's salvation, and he signed the pact. Tom reveals that he thinks this entity also talked to him, and Richard claims that it knows frightened men will do desperate things, before switching the subject to his children's things, him lamenting their loss and still holding some resentment for Sarah. He claims as long as there are men of his blood, they are bound to the covenant, but he is the last of his men, as all of his children were presumed to die once brought back to the mainland. He states that if they take him out beyond the point where the sailors fear, the bloodline will be gone and he will likely die of old age. freeing the island of the curse and officially allowing everyone to live there peacefully. It's then Sheriff Bashir arrives, and Patricia makes a mad and desperate distraction play in stealing his cop car, with Tom and Wick getting the coffin prepared and sailing out to sea, with a plan set in place to keep Wick safe and stop the boat before the border, but both still worried as these waters are considered Widow's Bay's very own Bermuda Triangle. It's during all this that we catch Evan hanging out with his new gal pal Kelly, who invites herself to spy into Tom's stuff, spouting on about how if Tom is lying, Evan has the moral high ground. She definitely seems like trouble. Either way, they find photos locked away of Evan's mom, who not only survived the childbirthing process that killed her, but was actually a part of Evan's life for a little bit. We cut back to Bashir, who had taken Patricia home and is just concerned on what exactly is going on with the island and what they're hiding. She starts to reveal a lot, but Bashir stops her, claiming that he actually isn't interested in hearing anymore, and instead he's just gonna grab his wife and bounce out of there ASAP, wishing them all the best of luck. Which I do not blame the guy, he might end up being the smartest character in the show. Back on the boat, Richard wants to be let out of the coffin, but Wick warns that you can't trust a man who knows death is coming for him, bringing up a photo of Jerry and Jerry's brother, a guy named Mark Doyle. He references how when they were 16 and the island went into lockdown, people started to go missing and curfews were established. He and Mark thought it was a perfect time to sneak out and go onto the boat. That's when something big with tentacles, likely the Kraken or even Cthulhu himself, had attacked them. And as Wick was panicking, he thought the monster had a hold of his leg, but it turns out it was Mark. And in a panic, he kicked Mark off and allowed the giant beast beneath them to take Mark to the bottom of the ocean. Wick only telling this very serious story so that Tom will listen and not let Richard Warren out. But
I already let him out. God damn you to hell.
And Wick is proven right when Richard Warren does eventually fear for his life and a struggle ensues, during which they're able to put Richard back inside the coffin, but Wick ends up falling off of the boat. Thankfully, he only falls off because Tom handed him a life preserver and kicked him off, which did result in Wick not going past the border and remaining alive and not falling under the island's curse. And once they pass the border, Richard Warren finally dies, and Tom is able to go back and save Wick, with them having a very nice bonding moment, though Tom still has to deal with Evan's reveal and resentment towards him, that and the fact that the island's events are likely to still persist despite Tom's best efforts, as it seems the painting in the inn we saw earlier in the series was actually alluding to the potential survival of one of Richard Warren's children, meaning the island was able to keep progressing and his descendants were able to live on. And resulting in us having to ask our question, if Richard Warren has descendants, who on the island could they be right now? Could it potentially be Patricia or her strange relationship with the boogeyman? Could it be Wick and his history with the town and all the knowledge he has altogether? Or, my personal theory, could it actually be Evan who's Richard Warren's descendants through his mother's side? And it actually makes perfect narrative sense if you think about it. Tom's entire character arc has been based around keeping Evan safe and on the island while also trying to manage the island altogether. But if Evan turns out to be a long-lost Warren, then that would mean that Evan would have to die for everything to get resolved. But it gets even more complicated when you consider the theory that I brought up last episode of Evan potentially being born off island and on the boat that his mom was on before they turned around. This potentially meaning that Evan doesn't suffer the same curse of not being able to leave the island. Narratively, this could lead to Evan either having to be sacrificed for the nightmares to stop, or even worse, leaving the town in endless nightmares while he lives off his life on the mainland. The real question is, if Evan is the descendant, will this reignite beef between both Tom and Wick? Wick wanting to fight for the islanders' safety, and Tom wanting to fight for the safety of his very own son? And could this also put Tom in a very similar position to Richard Warren, where the townsfolk end up betraying him? And there's still many mysteries left within this show. Like, if Richard Warren was an immortal who made a deal with some sort of devil, but was actually in his grave this entire time, then I wonder who exactly is the boogeyman. As per the stories told about him, he possesses the same immortality that Richard Warren had. And more than anything, what is exactly behind those iron doors beneath the basement? Either way, if you guys have any ideas, I'd love to hear them down below. This show's getting really good, and come back next week when From finally starts airing on TV again. Either way, thank you all for watching, really appreciate the support, and remember not to let a dead guy out of his coffin.